the literature course, we don't focus on grammar and usage, but we do rely on language to express ourselves, and repeated grammatical and syntactical errors can interfere with your clarity and also limit the success of an argument about a text. Also, they can damage your ethos, your ability to convince your reader of your authority. A grammatically correct essay demonstrates that you have mastered the intricacies of linguistic expression and makes you more credible as an interpreter of texts. You should not be concerned about these problems early in the drafting process, but when you graduate to the stage of making your draft presentable to others, watch for these various problems. Also, it will help you if you are aware that many of these kinds of errors one sees even in published work. We all make these errors. Most of us try to catch them. But think how much better you can feel when you sneer at the inferior, though published, writers still making mistakes that you have overcome. There are some things to keep in mind as you think about grammar. Grammar rules aren't simply a set of silly expectations created and enforced by anal retentive pedants, but common standards that allow us to communicate effectively with each other, just as a common understanding of traffic rules keeps us relatively safe on the highway, all those idiots texting on the freeway notwithstanding. The main danger of not following the rules is that you won't be understood by your reader as you intended. For example, vague pronouns can cause significant misunderstandings, and misplaced commas can completely change the meaning of a sentence. More importantly, proper grammar and usage are one way, along with evidence and proper documentation, that a writer establishes ethos, that a writer establishes for her reader that she is a credible authority and should be believed. Just as showing up for a formal dinner or a job interview in the wrong clothes or using bad manners at the dinner table will cause people to take you less seriously, showing ignorance of proper usage will make you less credible as a writer. However, the rules of usage are not set by Congress or proclaimed in sacred texts, and they evolve over time, like the gradual shift to use they or their as third-person singular pronouns, as opposed to he or she and his or hers. Also, it's important to remember that one may, and for good effect, violate the standards of proper grammar and usage if it works. Like Captain Barbossa's description of the Pirates Code, the rules of writing are, in general, guidelines, really.
The code is more what you call guidelines than actual rules.
It's really a cost-benefit analysis that determines when violating the rules is appropriate. Will the benefit gained be worth the risks of violating the accepted rules? If your abuse is effective, and you're aware of the risks, go for it. The following are some common mistakes to avoid in order to create a professional, scholarly ethos as a writer. One serious error is a sentence fragment, usually fragments the result of careless punctuation, stranding a dependent clause, which is a group of words with a subject and a verb, but which can't stand alone as a sentence. For example, while I was at the store. The writer puts a period where she meant a comma and then missed the mistake when proofreading. Usually, a sentence fragment is the result of a stranded participial phrase and can be combined with the next or the previous sentence to correct it. One method to catch these problems is to read each paragraph in reverse, starting at the end and recording each sentence one at a time. A comma splice is a much more common error in which the writer joins two independent clauses, which can stand alone as a sentence, but with only a comma. Instead, separate the clauses with a period, or join them with a comma and a coordinating conjunction, or a comma and a subordinating conjunction, or a semicolon or a colon, and we'll talk more about these methods in a bit. A run-on sentence is not simply a long sentence, as is often thought, but is a problem in which two or more independent clauses are joined with no punctuation whatsoever. In fact, a sentence can be quite long if it's punctuated correctly and if your reader is able to follow it, but it's usually better to break up long sentences. To correct the problem of a run-on sentence, the simplest solution is simply to separate the clauses with a period, but a comma and a coordinating conjunction or a semicolon would work too. Here are some methods to repair those more serious sentence errors. If you are combining two independent clauses, you can use a comma with a coordinating conjunction. Coordinating conjunctions are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. Remember the acronym FANBOYS. Remember, if you join two independent clauses with only a comma, you have a comma splice. Don't forget the conjunction. If you're joining an independent clause, which can stand alone as a sentence, and a dependent clause, which cannot, use a comma alone. A dependent clause is usually introduced by a subordinating conjunction, such as while, because, or although. If you are combining two independent clauses, you can use a semicolon to show that these two ideas are so closely related that they belong in the same sentence. But remember that both clauses must be independent. A semicolon is like a soft period. You cannot use it when a comma would be appropriate. A colon shows that the sentence after the colon renames some part of the sentence before it. So if you're restating an idea in other words, introducing a list, or providing an example, you can use a colon to show your reader your intention. Remember that you must have an independent clause before the colon, but you can follow it with another independent clause or a series of items. To test if you can properly use a colon, insert the word namely where you place the colon. If it fits, the colon is appropriate. By the way, notice the proper use of the colon to introduce an example. Here are some other common mistakes which can frustrate or confuse your reader and damage your effectiveness and credibility. A recent trend is the use of the lazy dash, using an EM dash, that long dash in the middle of a sentence, in the place of proper punctuation. You're telling your readers, I'm too lazy to figure out the relationship between my ideas and to use the proper punctuation to show that relationship. You figure it out. Your reader is not going to spend too much time deciphering your point and may just skip it or misunderstand you, and in both cases you have failed to make your point. Figure out and use the proper punctuation which accurately indicates the relation between your ideas. Dashes are properly used only in pairs to designate parenthetical ideas or non-restrictive appositives, that is, additional ideas that don't change the meaning of the sentence. They're a mild form of parentheses. Also, when typing a dash, type 2 hyphens with no spaces. MS Word will substitute an actual dash. One way to really frustrate a reader is by using vague pronoun references. A pronoun, such as he, she, it, they, refers to the noun closest to it. But if there are multiple nouns in the sentence, the reference can be confusing. Even if it sounds awkward, it's better to be clear, so repeat the proper noun or name instead of using a pronoun. The most common vague pronoun reference, and probably the most frustrating one, is using this without letting your reader know what this is. It's very common for people to use this to refer to something in the previous sentence, paragraph, or even an earlier part of the essay, but without a clear noun referent, how is your reader supposed to know to what you're referring? For example, this caused the fall of the Roman Empire. This what? The word this could refer to any of the nouns in the previous sentences and could confuse your reader. Never use this without a noun immediately next to it. The only exception is when the referent is obvious, so that your reader should be able to figure it out easily, such as with a noun referent, when the intended noun is on the other side of the verb to be, such as is, was, etc. Etc. is an abbreviation of the Latin words et cetera, which means and the rest of the things. It's common in informal writing to use etc. to designate that there are more items in a list, but that there's not enough space, time, or interest to list them. In a formal argument, though, it's a form of an unfinished claim, implying something that may not exist. If the ideas are important enough to list them explicitly. If you're only providing examples, then use such as to indicate that these are examples chosen from a larger set. And you're not supposed to use abbreviations in formal prose anyway. The following are less serious mistakes, but can still be annoying to a reader. Relatively recently, some writers have begun to use said when they mean this, thinking apparently that it sounds more professional or scholarly. However, Using said in place of a definite article is jargon, a form of legalese, and sounds stilted and even silly when used outside of a legal document. Use this or these instead. The pronouns are simpler and sound less stilted and less affected. This is really not a big problem, but it does perhaps affect your professionalism. It's common to use quote when one means quotation, and this is fine in informal speech, but it's not standard written English. When you quote someone, an action denoted by a verb, you provide a quotation, a thing denoted by a noun. Using the verb quote when you describe a quotation is a colloquialism, and you will be understood, but it's not strictly correct and sounds less formal. I see the next problem often, but oddly only in the last 2 or 3 years, when writers have begun to adopt the colloquialism based off of when they mean based on. Things are placed on bases, not off of them. Based on is the formally correct form and uses fewer words to say the same thing, which is always an advantage. Another colloquialism that has invaded academic essays is the omission of the preposition of from a couple of whatever. A couple basketballs is a colloquialism and not standard written English. Even in published documents, supposedly educated writers are using societal when they mean social. Societal and social are not synonyms, so don't use societal when you mean social. Confusing the two terms is destroying an important distinction. Societal refers to structural elements of a society, things that can be compared between different society. Food preparation, property transference, and marriage customs are societal elements, parts of the structure of a society that different societies have. Social, on the other hand, refers to elements within a society, such as specific social beliefs, rules, or behaviors. The expectation that one wears clothes is a social behavior. The best writing uses the simplest language, which is adequate to clearly communicate its ideas and arguments. Complex ideas and sophisticated arguments require complex and sophisticated language. But the best writers can make even complex ideas seem clear by using the simplest language that is capable of communicating their ideas. Unnecessarily complex language is like a child dressed in her parents' clothes. Putting on adult clothes does not make one an adult, and usually has the opposite effect, making her look even more childish by contrast. Using unnecessarily complex language doesn't make an argument sophisticated, just confusing, verbose, and even affected, and can diminish a writer's credibility. Now, it's time to go back to your rough drafts, review the various suggestions that I've made above, and see if you can simplify and clarify your argument.